was a decision that was made because it kind of fit, and it was kind of like a culture fit at the time in games. But now, when you look at games tend to be a little bit more careful, a little bit more respectful, a little bit more diverse about that kind of stuff. And I think that's great. Like, let's do that, and then we can still have the vase. Like, I don't make the vase. Like, I don't care. It's just a shame that that was the default,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
So I think a lot of the games community right now is us making up for mistakes. Like, as an industry, we've made mistakes. We've made the primary mistake we made is that we always pretended we knew what we were doing,
Yeah.
and that's the most damaging lie that has ever been told in the history of video games.
And like you're saying too, I mean, before it's still young. We're still all like growing up from it and learning as we go along.
Our heroes are just starting to die, right? Like, our the first like pioneers of game development are just starting to pass away from old age.
That's so
That's
crazy.
how young that is. Like, we
Yeah.
we are starting to lose some of our heroes, right? Like, we're starting to see people jump out of roles they've had for life, like Iwata passing away, Reggie going and like leaving his post. It's like,
Yeah.
what? Or Rough Bear, like seeing things like that where you're like, wow,
Yeah.
that's true. I guess people do pass away. I've never had that. Like, in games, if you want to talk to somebody who was there at the start, you just go to them and talk to them.
Yeah.
Try doing that for theater, right? Like, it doesn't. You can't. Or like movies, it's like
Right.
it's
Yep.
such a we're carrying the torch of play, which is super old. But games as a medium are so young that the mistakes we made are still fresh, and it's not the fault of anybody that came before us, but it is the effect of what came before us, and we need to deal with that. We need to look at that. So the first thing we need to teach people is that we don't know what we're doing, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, we need to be more honest about the business reality of our work, because honestly, we didn't. And then we got this weird period of time where we were making $70 games or $60 games on budgets that were growing and growing with more and more people, and we couldn't support it. So instead of doing that, we didn't just make the games more expensive. No, we started doing DLCs, and then DLCs turned out to work really well. And then instead of DLCs, we started doing season passes because people didn't like DLCs or buying them multiple times. So what if you just buy all of them up front? And then we could just figure out how much money we make and then make DLCs that fit that. Although usually we'd be working on the DLCs already, so how much money we make doesn't really affect that. But somehow people ended up thinking, and we didn't communicate. We've been like, oh, we know exactly what we're doing. Here's the plan, and it's like, in reality, it's like, oh shit, what are we doing? Is this it? Did we have enough money to do two DLCs? Because we kind of promised two DLCs. We should do we have some content that we can still, like, like, there's so much discussion going on, and then people find like a file in the game, and it's like this level that was cut, and then the level gets put in DLC, and it's like, the level was just geometry, right? Like, there was not, it was just, this is just how it looks. Like, we redid that, the flow wasn't good, this quarter got changed, like, it was 6 months of work. But we're so bad at just explaining. We
Mm.
just don't, because when you do like a making of a game studio, it's just a happy person sitting at a computer, like opening the jaw of a dog and closing it again, and then 3D modeling stuff. And it's like, that's it. Like, that's literally, this is one of the biggest jokes in the games industry. Is this Call of Duty documentary about how Call of Duty was made. It was like, which one, Ghost or something, and there was a dog in it. And so in the making of documentary, there's just like one shot about game development, and this 3D modeler sitting there, just opening the jaw of the dog and closing it again, and that's the full shot. And we're just like, yep, this is game development. We just have a dog, and then the dog magically appears, and we can magically open the jaw, and it's great. But even when we're trying, we do a bad job. Like, documentaries that go and show like motion capture, right? It's like you see somebody walk, and then you have like the wireframe next to them, and then you have the full model next to it, right? And that's usually how they show that. That's nonsense. Like, the motion capture person has like 100,000 dots on them. Those dots get loaded into software. Those dots have to be connected to a skeleton that was pre-made by somebody. So they had to make that skeleton. That skeleton is based on the model, so the model already existed. Then we have to do this thing where we have to, for that skeleton, which are just lines and points, we have to attach parts of the model to those dots so that they deform the right way, right? So that not like if you move the bottom of your arm, that the top of your arm also moves. We have to like be very clear to the software that it's like, no, this is actually the bottom arm. And then we take the motion capture, we attach all those dots to that skeleton so that that works. Then somebody has to clean it up because there's always going to be this weird thing in your armpits where your armpit just kind of glitches out
Right.
in your models. I don't know why it's always the armpit, but it's always the armpit. Like anything that kind of looks like an armpit is bad. So sort of like groin area, armpits, all of that, knees, all terrible. Somebody has to fix all that. And then we have a somewhat working model. And then we just clean it up, texture, normals, all that.
Right.
That's like months of work. And then in the making of documentary, we were like, okay, so we did the motion capture and then we had a fully animated 3D model. And it's like, no, come on, don't say that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Don't, please don't say that. Like, this is rough work.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's like giving, because it's no, I think part of it too is just the representation, and no one wants the slice of life because I mean, they just want all the like all the good stuff right from the get go. But the reality of it is that it's never that easy. But that's always what's represented.
yeah, because that's what people want to hear. Like, nobody wants to buy a game where the development story is like, oh shit, yeah, we were locking in stuff 3 months before gold. We had no idea what the story was.
Yep.
Like, nobody's gonna buy that game. Nobody's gonna go like, oh yeah, no, awesome. Like that's a story that you tell like 2 years later. But the reality is, that the writers will fix it is like an actual saying in the games industry. It's genuinely because when you make a game, you don't write the story and then you make the levels based on it. You kind of like write sort of like what the story direction is. You make a bunch of set pieces and then you kind of like
Yeah.
put them together. But then, you don't have time to actually finish level 3, which is the level that kind of transitions you from like the space scene to the Earth scene. You don't have money to do that, so that gets cut. And we actually instead move level 7 to like level 3 because that's kind of like the inverse. So we'll just flip around some stuff and then I guess we'll just use that as transition. Or maybe we'll just do a cutscene. Anyway, we have this now. This set piece got moved here. Hey, writers, can you fix that? And then the writers just have to write a new story around this, right? Like they do some recasts, they do some re-recording with the voice actors. Like the honest truth is 70% of your video games, like half a year in advance, they had no idea what the story was going to be.
Yeah. And
We don't know.
It's funny because I think the filmmaking industry is like that too, but it just goes to show though to a degree in terms of like how this all like it's almost like to a degree important to know these things too, because how it affects the final output and how what we were talking about with the the community and the culture as a whole. Knowing these things, I think, can better shape what this community, this gaming culture and everything is to expect, because now they can't just go and assume it's like, hey, everything's just slapped together and packaged nice for me to play, and that's the extent of it. There's so much more involved where in some ways, I think, and this is what we're seeing happening too, is people are becoming more appreciative and understand it. And I think it starts at the level, I don't want to just say it's only indie devs, because I see a lot of AAA titles to some degree doing this too, but providing that transparency and insight. And that's how I think ultimately our culture is really, the gaming culture is shifting in a better position, because we're having these types of conversations and they continue to happen too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree fully with what you just said. It's transparency. That's the right word.
Awesome. Wow. We definitely covered a lot there, Rami.
Yeah, we did.
Now, before we close, because I would love for you to kind of maybe provide just a few key points that you could offer to some indie devs on how to leverage their, how to leverage their efforts in creating a community.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I think number one is focus on the kindness more than anything else, right? Like focus on the kindness of your community, focus on their empathy, their ability to deal with criticism. And the best way you can do that is by setting a good example. So spend a lot of time in that early community setting the tone, and spend a lot of time correcting tone when you need to, not by calling people out, by just being the right example, right? If somebody asks something and everybody's going like, but that's not what this game is, instead of ignoring that or piling on, It's got like, no, actually, that's a consideration we had during development, but we made these, and these calls because this and this is the experience we wanted. Because now not only have you answered that question in a way, you've also shown the proper way of answering that question, and you've given people information to answer it.
Yep.
So I think that's a pretty important one. The second one is, and I guess you just brought up this, but like it's transparency.
Mm.
So a lot of developers, their first response to anything bad happening is to not want to talk about it.
Yeah.
The truth is that you want to talk about it, but you want to contextualize it. So you want to always make sure that it's clear why certain things happen and why they happen the way they did. That doesn't necessarily mean that you need to talk about everything. There's also a very important third part, but being transparent about why things went wrong or didn't go the way you expected them to is very important. The same way as with the first point, it's important that you do that in a way that empowers your community to repeat that. To just say like, oh, the developer said this and that. And the only way they can do that if it's a coherent story, which means it's a true story, right? Mm. So be transparent. Don't make things nicer than they are. Don't make things worse as they are. Be honest about things, and that'll usually be pretty effective. The third thing, though, which might be a little, wow, my voice. The third thing, which might be a little at odds with that, is you want to manage expectations very well. Right. So try and not make promises you can't keep. Try to not even hint at promises you can't keep. And then go with that. Instead of like, just saying like, oh yeah, we're working on a multiplayer mode, but we're not quite sure it's going to go in. Like, just you don't have to mention that, right? Like, right. Just yeah. Because we're so bad at communicating, a lot of like small expectations turn into really big expectations. And since community happens not only where you can see it, stories get out of hand really quick. For Nuclear Throne, we once said like, oh yeah, we're exploring some multiplayer stuff, but we're probably not doing it. And like, I still get messages from people that are like, "Where's the promised multiplayer mode?" I'm like, we did not. We
what? When did I say that?
Yeah, we have offline multiplayer, and they're like, "No, you said online multiplayer." I'm like, I never said online multiplayer. We've never said online multiplayer. And they're like, "Well, I heard you said that." I'm like, yeah. So managing expectations is also really important, and one way to do that is by not always talking about everything. That sounds contradictory with transparency, but the difference is that you cannot talk about things that are going well. You just talk about things that are going poorly. That's the part where you always have to be fully transparent. If you want to have a surprise for your community, have a surprise for your community.
Yeah.
Right? If there's like a secret level, don't tell people, oh yeah, no, we have 4 secret levels. It's
one
like,
way
no.
I like to look at it is under promise and over deliver, and have that be a foresight, because then you don't have to worry about saying everything, and I think that's at least I use that as a helpful guideline in terms of the transparency issue, because it's like, I mean, come on, how many people want to know everything? How many of your friends really want to know everything about your life? No one ever does. But if it's come somewhat as need to basis type thing, and and just to be discreet about it, or within reason, obviously. And I think you outlined some really good reasons there too.
Yeah, and I think finally, just have fun with your community.
Yeah.
Like, the people forget. Sometimes developers forget that our job is also fun. And that if you've made a community that is fun, that you can just have fun with them. One of my favorite Nuclear Throne memories is there was this live streamer, Star, who would live stream the game, and I once caught him streaming, and he was complaining about why the game was a certain frame rate, and I explained that was because that frame rate is locked to the movement speed. So if you double the frame rate, everything would move twice as fast, which is a terrible way of programming games, but that's how we did it, right? So he said, oh, I can handle that. So I just went, and I just made him a build, like as he was playing, and I sent it to him. I'm like, well, play it. And he's like, is this? I'm like, yeah, this is 60 frames per second. And he's like, well, okay. So I booted it up, and it was terrible, right? Because it moved twice as fast, and I hadn't adjusted anything else. And then for the rest of the stream, we just made worse and worse stuff. Like, we added like weapons that made no sense. I made a nuclear rocket launcher that shot lasers, that shot bullets, and the lasers were going like the colors of rainbows. And we were just trying to crash the game, trying to see how much it could handle. And eventually, just the entire screen was white from all the lasers just shooting over each other. The sound engine would like kind of like fart every like every 50 seconds or something because he was trying to catch up and playing 100,000 sounds at once. And it was just one of the funnest things I've done in my career.